The Australian Financial Review.
In January 2023, police stormed the offices of a nondescript tower in Belgrade, Serbia. Officially, it was a call centre. But what authorities discovered was one of the key hubs in an alleged global scam network. Among the files seized that day were the names of 100,000 victims, and almost 40,000 were Australians. When Financial Review journalist Lucy King reached out to them, they each told a similar story.
Hello.
Hi, it's Lucy King from the Fin Review. How are you?
I actually just thought it was like an investor that was helping me.
We just buy the coin and we sell it the next day. And
Popped up as an educational platform on crypto and investing. And
wanted me to go to my super. How am I going to get my money back?
And then a week later, he wanted more. He wanted 60,000.
Wanted to just run away and hope that this wasn't true.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Lucy King on the global scam operators targeting Australian investors. How the brother of Olympic breakdancer Raygun came to be working for one of them, and why they are so hard to shut down. It's Thursday, February 12th. Hi, Lucy. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Hi, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Lucy, everyone knows someone or has heard of someone who's been touched by one of these online investment scams. What are the numbers? How widespread is it in Australia?
So the numbers we have are from the National Anti-Scam Centre and based on people reporting losses. So we know that of the reported losses, there was more than $172 million lost in 2025, just in 1 year. But from my experience of talking to scam victims, most of the people I've spoken to don't report their losses at all. So I can only imagine that that is a huge underestimate of the real problem.
Because they're embarrassed.
There's a lot of shame about being caught as a victim in one of these scams. Yeah. Australia is a huge target in the world, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that we speak English, and so, it's accessible to call us by phone from English-speaking countries. It's also because we have these huge pots of money in super. That's well known among these scamming networks. So countries like Australia, Canada, they really stick out in terms of numbers of victims. So over the last 6 months-ish, I've been looking into scams and cryptocurrency-related crime. And through that work, I spoke to a source who's very close to investigating these types of scams. And during the course of that conversation, he said that although there looks like there's lots of different types of scams in Australia, you can count on less than two hands how many people are actually running the thousands of scams that are causing so much damage.
So these scams are sophisticated, they're global in scale, they're coordinated. As you said, you've been looking into crypto-related scams. Tell us a bit more about that. What led you to this story and how did you come to be reporting about one particular global investment scam?
So I was looking into a series of stories about crypto-related crimes over the last few months. And through that work, I had this one particular conversation with a source that was really interesting. He mentioned a specific name. He actually told me there was an Israeli couple and they were allegedly running most of the scams in Australia. I thought that was fascinating because, firstly, if we know their name, why aren't they arrested? Why are they still running scams? So the name was Eliran Oved and his wife, Liat. But that was sort of all I had. I just knew that this source was saying that they were running most of the scams. I had no evidence. I had no way of pushing it any further. So it sort of sat on my list of interesting things that I should look into. And then a few weeks later, I got a phone call from the same source that said that was an investigative journalist in Europe who was looking into the Oveds and had some evidence related to the scamming network that they were running. Was I interested in speaking to him? Of course I was interested in talking to him. So I jumped on the phone with an investigative journalist from Europe called Max Pena, who worked for a nonprofit called Investigate Europe. Max was working with Sasa from the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, which was in Serbia. And he had been working for the last few months on this investigation, trying to connect the OVEDs to the call centre that had been raided. And they'd done some really impressive work digging into the corporate registries in multiple countries, connecting all the corporate registers together to show that the OVEDs had control over these call centres, but also the scams that the call centres were running.
So let's get back to the raid in Belgrade, Serbia. What happened in that raid?
So in January 2023, Europol teamed up with some German authorities and Serbian authorities to raid 22 locations on the same day because they suspected that they were all part of the same network, the same global scam network. And so they raided this call centre and they seized hard drives from the call centre that really exposed the scammers' playbook. We got sales agents with anglicised names promising fantastically high returns on crypto investment schemes, only to abandon clients when they either ran out of funds or sought to withdraw them. And one of the pieces of evidence was essentially a list of clients. Mm-hmm. But actually, it was a list of people who had all fallen victim from the 70 different scams that this call centre were pushing. Within that list of about 100,000 global victims' names, there were about 40,000 names that were Australian. And that's why Max thought that I would be interested in working together with him, because there was such an Australian element to the story. Yeah, it was clear that Australia was a huge target for this call centre, or possibly the scamming network as a whole. And so looking into that end of the story, the victim end, would make for a more complete investigation.
So we'll get to what you did with that list of Australian names. But before we do, tell us about the OVEDs who are allegedly behind the scheme. And we should say here that despite the raids and the ongoing investigations, the couple haven't been charged in relation to the Serbian call centre. So who are the OVEDs and what do we know about them?
So there are some interesting clues about their lives that we can find from social media and from online and legal documents. You can see that Eliran Oved, he's seemingly very happily married to his wife Liat. They have a pretty flashy life. They go to really nice European destinations. He clearly owns a football club which is based in Tel Aviv and makes local TV appearances. And in October last year, it was reported in the Israeli media that the couple had bought a very large Tel Aviv villa for $28 million, which the article described as one of the largest private real estate transactions in recent years. So from the public perspective, it looked like he was sort of relatively high profile, relatively rich. But the legal documents told a slightly different story than the social media. So when I looked at the legal documents, I could see that he had got into trouble in around 2012 for a trading scheme that was illegal and had served a year in jail.
So you got a list of nearly 40,000 Australian victims as part of that raid in Belgrade. What did you do with it?
So my first instincts were just to figure out how genuine this list was. So I became very familiar with it. It was really interesting to see the little notes that the sales agents had written. You know, they might write next to a name, big super fund, or has a wife with a particular car. You know, the kind of notes that a sales agent might write to get closer to the client they were speaking to. So it was just interesting to see
how it worked.
Yeah. And then my first desire was to contact all 40,000 because I was really interested in proving the extent of the damage of these scams, because I think a lot of stories tend to focus on one victim and, you know, you get very involved in that one story. But actually my interest in this story was, let's show the sheer scale of the damage from a single scamming network. But unfortunately, in order to contact 40,000 people, you have to use some of the same softwares that scammers use, you know. So I realized that I had to contact them manually and in a very genuine way. And so I wondered what the largest number of manual contacts I could make. I came up with a goal for myself that if I sent 35 emails a day for 3 weeks, then I would reach about 500. And the reason I got to that number was because I'd gone through the list and I'd picked out the ones that seemed most interesting to me. The people who were most interesting were the names where I knew the sales agent they thought they were speaking to, but I actually had the name of the real person they were speaking to. And I was really interested in the people who'd been scammed twice by 2 different schemes. So that created a short list of about 500 names, and I worked my way through those. And sure enough, out of about 500 emails that I sent, I only got 31 people who were willing to speak to me. But actually, 31 is actually a pretty big number when you for a single story. So I was in a good place by the end of that 3 weeks.
And the ones that did respond were happy to talk with you. When you managed to speak with some of those victims, what did they tell you?
So the ones who did contact me were actually really happy I contacted them.
I think this is a story. This has just got to be told.
Amazing that was found somewhere, in another country. I'm just astounded by that.
This was money that they had perhaps lost a couple of years ago.
They actually took all my savings, which was only $4,500, and they took it before Christmas.
Oh no, you've pressed the wrong button, and then you just watch the money on their trading account just go down, down, down,
Talking
down.
about this is savings over uni, and you decide whether it goes into your super or a house deposit.
The money dried up, and I was trying to get in touch with them, and I couldn't get in touch with them anymore.
They'd been absolutely blanked and dropped by their sales agent. Their number didn't work, their email didn't work, the police weren't helping them if they had reported it to the police. So it was great just to speak to somebody who was interested in the story of their loss.
It was for 3 lessons on how to get started into Bitcoin.
They had pretty similar stories.
I think I found them on a website in London.
They had responded to some sort of social media advert promising high gains from an investment scheme.
Trying to do something on my own and have the education behind it.
But I saw a famous chef on an ad. He made so much money, and I'm thinking, well, I really like that chef. That was Pete Evans. I found out later that it's not even him.
They had usually put in only $250 at first.
Because I put that $2.99 in, that got started.
$250 as a starter kit.
I'm thinking it's only $200.
Then maybe $1,000, then more, then more.
Mate, I need you to put in $1,000.
At this stage, I put in about 3,000 all up.
I go to their first level, which happened to be 50,000 US.
Until their money ran out or they wanted to withdraw. The victims thought that they were speaking to them and they were based in London. The sales agents were based in London. But in actual fact, they were in this call centre in Serbia. So the way these schemes worked was they all followed a really similar pattern. You would log into an online portal.
Welcome to Grand Pacific, the home of professional traders. Not dissimilar to for ComSec or to a very professionally run site.
The different kinds of investing, the terminologies. So it did sound like a big operation.
That portal would look really professional.
The website was just absolutely unbelievable. Terms and conditions, everything was so real.
You'd be really impressed and convinced that it was a real thing. And you would see your money flow into the portal and then make some miraculous gains.
I'm watching my money go up and up and up.
Within a couple of weeks, I was up to, $20,000 or $30,000.
And it went up. So I dropped 10 grand into it.
Over time, in a relatively short window of time, that particular scheme would be flagged and shut down, and another one would crop up. Using, the same inner machinery, the portal would look similar but different, but equally professional. On top of that, part of the setup that the sales agents would establish with the victims would be to install some sort of screen viewing software.
Yes, they requested that I used GoToMeetings. That was kind of how the relationship was built with the training. And
Full control on my screen. It's telling me what to do on my screen.
He was taken over. I could see the little mouse, working it all.
And that would allow the agents to see the victim's screen. There were various benefits to doing that. One of the benefits was that they could see how much was in their bank account. They would make it a goal that within the first session or two, they would have the victim log into their bank account for some reason or another. And that would enable the agent to see the figure. And then they would try and get that figure. That was their goal. It was a very clear way of understanding how much money these victims had. So in order for these scam networks to function, the kingpins who are based abroad need people in the actual countries to be funneling the funds from the victims from the Australian bank accounts to them. And we discovered that a name that was coming up again and again connected to the OVED's network was the brother of Australia's famous Olympic breakdancer, Raygun.
We're talking about a global investment scam that has at least 100,000 victims, almost 40,000 of them in Australia. Lucy, you discovered a high-profile Australian connection. How did Brendan Gunn, the brother of Australia's Olympic breaker Raygun, who we all remember, come to be involved with the operators of this scam, and what did he do for the OVEDs?
Yeah, so it's probably worth mentioning at this point that Rachel Gunn, or Raygun, has nothing to do with her brother's actions, and her agent says that the two siblings haven't spoken for the last few years. So we know that Brendan Gunn, since his 20s, was operating as what they call a responsible person in the room for ASIC registered businesses. So he would be the local director named on the registration. He held an Australian financial services license back in his 20s, although that has since lapsed. And at some point around 2017, he came into contact with the OVEDs. We're not entirely sure how they were connected, but it was probable that for the OVEDs looking to set up Australian businesses, Gunn's knowledge of the regulatory landscape was very appealing. They needed someone
He'd
Australian.
be useful.
Yeah. And so within the space of a few months in 2018, suddenly Brendan Gunn is the named director of at least 4 companies that the OVEDs owned. So they had a very tight business relationship relatively quickly. What I've since learned, it works well if you run a global scam network, is to have local straw directors who are disconnected from the marketing of the schemes. They're not selling the schemes. They're actually sort of willfully blind of the damaging aspects of the business, but they lend a legitimate name to the business. So you can register with ASIC, you can have a named director. That director can truthfully not know all of the damage that the business is creating. And so that's allegedly what Brendan Gunn was doing for them. He was the named director, but he wasn't selling the schemes. He wasn't involved in the marketing. But on the other hand, the role that Brendan Gunn was serving for the OVEDs was allegedly to set up Australian bank accounts so the victims' investments could be funneled through the bank account and then abroad, so that funds would flow through these accounts so that they could get hold of them. That's actually a really hard job because if you can imagine, there's thousands of scams running. These victims will at some point realize it's a scam, make a complaint. The bank will have that account flagged, and then eventually they will shut that account down. And so Brendan Gunn spent a lot of time on the phone trying to set up new accounts, trying to explain to the bank why these transactions were being flagged. So there was a real job there, a real full-time job trying to keep this money flowing. There was a particular text message exchange where Brendan was saying that he'd just spent the last 4 hours on the phone to banks, and that was actually directly to Eliran OVED. So once we realised that Brendan Gunn was a name of interest connected to the OVEDs and that he was the local director named on most of the Australian businesses that the OVEDs owned, we then started plotting all the businesses that Brendan Gunn owned and was connected to. And there was a huge amount of businesses or registered business names that he was connected to. Everything from wine businesses to clothing businesses to personal fitness business. I mean, you name it. It was seemingly not possible for a single man to have such a varied career. And so it was sort of instantly suspicious. Why would you set up so many registered business names?
And so all of this has caught up with Brendan Gunn. Last month he was in court. Just as you were researching your story, he was in court pleading guilty to charges related to one of these cryptocurrency scams. What did he plead guilty to and what punishment is he looking at?
Gunn pleaded guilty to dealing with more than $180,000 that ASIC says was reasonable to suspect that those funds were the proceeds of crime. And for that, he'll be sentenced later this year. The maximum penalty for that is 1 year imprisonment or a fine of up to $12,600, a number that pales in comparison with the losses. The average victim we contacted lost just over $80,000. while the seized database lists about 100,000 victims worldwide, targeted by just one arm of the OVED network. So the harm is really enormous here. So basically, the case that's going through court this year is specifically related to one of the companies that the OVEDs owned and Gunn was a director for, called More Markets. And it was registered as a crypto exchange. And it advertised itself as being able to convert Australian dollars into crypto. In reality, what it was allegedly doing was just taking the Australian dollars, and the victims were not able to see those funds again. And ASIC are prosecuting him specifically for 3 checks relating to those victim funds. ASIC made the point that he was not involved in the marketing of these schemes. That's by design, so that the local directors can distance themselves from that aspect of the damage of the business.
And Brendan Gunn is just one of these straw directors, these dummy directors that the scam operators are using. Are the Australian Federal Police and ASIC pursuing others?
There were a few names that came up when we sketched the corporate network. Gunn was the one that had the most evidence around him, and so that's where we focused our investigation. But there were many other names that have not been prosecuted and remain untouched in terms of the regulators. There's a few directors, particularly connected to the OVED network, that have for many years served as the local director for their associated companies and not yet faced any prosecution by the regulators. In actual fact, it's quite rare for directors to be banned. There were only 14 in the last financial year. It's actually quite hard to ban a director. You have to go through court. There has to be evidence. You also have to, in some way, connect seemingly disconnected companies together to prove a pattern. And actually, the regulation tends to be based on individual companies as opposed to a career's worth of companies. So the way in which these crimes are committed does not necessarily connect too well to the way in which the regulation runs.
So a final question, Lucy. Is enough being done to stop the rush of online investment scams in Australia that seem to be making so much money for these global operators like the OVEDs?
When you look at the complexity and the genius of this network that has been running allegedly for at least 10 years now, we know that the OVEDs have probably perfected the art of the investment scam for a very long time. It takes a long time to get to where they've got to in terms of setting up the right call centres in the right places with the right sales agents and the right web developers and the right local directors who can keep the money flowing. All of that. Just like any big corporation, takes a long time to set up. So although you could think that if you were to shut them down, another would take their place, but actually it would take a very long time to fill their boots. And so, in short, no, I don't think there's enough being done, because although it's hard to chase thousands of victims' funds once they get scammed, if there really is less than a handful of people in the world running these thousands of scams that are causing so much widespread harm in Australia, why on earth aren't we seeing more of these kingpins brought to justice?
Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review journalist Lucy King joining the podcast today. Thanks to the victims who were willing to share their stories for this episode. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin. Head of audio is Alex Gow. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content, and our theme is by Alex Gow. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend, as it helps others find us and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.